based on an article from Ackerman. There were like 14 different or 15 different footnotes, and 13 of them were for one Ackerman article.
Very, very soon after we heard that something had changed at the highest levels of the US government, I had to go back to an FBI facility to give my standard Al-Qaeda lecture. And then suddenly the FBI said, well, we need all your slide deck in advance, and we have to send it off somewhere to get it approved. And that's when I first heard about it. And then a week or two later, an anonymized email gets forwarded to me by the FBI in which somebody somewhere took offense to various of my slides, called them inflammatory, and basically said either these are removed or you don't get to brief in front of federal law enforcement. And the really strange thing was, is not only was I not allowed to appeal or discuss with this faceless person what the issues were, not even the FBI could identify who this individual was, who I later found out was somebody inside the civil rights section of DOJ at the highest levels.
We are reviewing all of the materials, all of our training materials, to ensure that that kind of misinformation is not being used, because that can really undermine the really substantial outreach efforts that we have made, and really have a negative impact on our ability to communicate effectively, as we have in the past, with this community. And I almost hesitate to say this community, because the reality is when we say Muslim Americans, we're talking about Americans.
Of course, if you step back the clock a little bit, you'll recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood demanded a purge in that letter to Brennan that you had at the White House, that the White House conformed to. They said they're going to do that. And I remember every time I asked, you'd get those little conversations or sidebar discussions, and they all said, Steve, we'd like to do something about this, but it's coming from the White House. So I knew I was done.
While Coughlin and Gorka struggled to get answers, the Islamic groups calling for the purge had little trouble communicating their demands to senior leadership in the U.S. government. On February 8, 2012, then FBI Director Robert Mueller met with representatives from 6 Islamic organizations, including ISNA, to discuss the results of the purge. Eventually, lawmakers learned that the Bureau removed 876 documents and nearly 400 presentations from its training programs based on the recommendations from 5 so-called subject matter experts.
We would like to know who these subject matter experts are that are going through the FBI material and purging that of reference to jihad and Islam and these type of things.
When lawmakers demanded more information on the purging of training materials, officials at the FBI and the Department of Defense quickly classified much of the information, including the identities of the subject matter experts.
There was no reason to classify the names of the subject matter experts who went through and purged the material. I think those things were classified more out of a concern, out of being embarrassed by who they were, rather than out of protecting the American public. This is all about political correctness.
So you're in a situation where you have our government classifying people who are playing a role in our understanding of the nature of the enemy in the war on terror against the American people. It's classified from our understanding. And I think that's because they know that these people can't stand up to scrutiny.
On March 23, 2012, a senior FBI official met with staff members from the House Judiciary Committee to address their concerns regarding the purge. For the Record has obtained a transcript of that meeting, and at one point, a congressional staff member openly questioned the government's track record in selecting Islamic advisors. The individual asked the FBI agent, quote, "How do we know these subject matter experts are good guys?" The FBI official responded, "I guess ultimately, I don't."
The parallel I always give is, imagine if during World War II it would have been illegal to use the word Nazi in US government. Imagine during the civil rights campaigns during the 40s and 50s when the FBI was trying to hunt down and close down the Ku Klux Klan and those people that were lynching black-skinned Americans. Imagine if anybody in U.S. government has said, you are not allowed to call these individuals bigots, racists, or white supremacists. That individual would have been excoriated, would have been kicked out of office before he could have blinked. It is so unethical, so un-American that, of course, they have to protect themselves somehow through the cloak of anonymity.
Welcome back. In 2011 and 2012, the counterterrorism materials used to train federal law enforcement and the military were dramatically altered. Muslim American groups, several of which are inextricably linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, demanded a purge of documents they called offensive. But until last year, most of the content deemed offensive was concealed from the American people. Several groups have sued the government under the Freedom of Information Act to find out exactly what was removed. What they found said a lot about America's vulnerability and the cost of political correctness.
There's a group of terrorist front groups here in the United States that are treated by some in the media as legitimate civil rights organizations on behalf of Muslims or Islamists, when in fact they're nothing but fronts for foreign terrorist organizations.
Tom Fitton is the president of Judicial Watch, a group that has used the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, to expose how the purge has severely restricted law enforcement and the Defense Department's understanding of the nation's enemies.
It began in the Bush administration, frankly, and it grew worse under the Obama administration, and now we can't use the word jihadist or Islamist or talk about the religious roots of al-Qaeda terrorism and Islamic terrorism in our national intelligence establishment.
In June 2013, Judicial Watch released hundreds of pages of FBI documents obtained through a FOIA lawsuit. For the first time, training materials that were deemed offensive by the Bureau's subject matter experts were released. The documents clearly show instances where the subject matter experts make vague claims when identifying materials to be removed, such as the overall tenor of certain presentations is problematic or too informal in the current political context. Judicial Watch also found that the FBI's subject matter experts rejected statements of fact, such as the Muslim Brotherhood's ties to terrorism or al-Qaeda's connection to past attacks.
Well, it would be as if we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union and telling the FBI and the military not to talk about communism or understand what communism is about or read the writings of Marx. It's just insanity. We're letting the foxes run the henhouse.
I mean, think about what's being purged here. A lot of what's being purged is what in the 1990s we called evidence.
Andrew McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor. In 1995, McCarthy led the successful prosecution against 12 individuals, including Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, known as the Blind Sheikh, for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and other planned attacks against New York City landmarks.
In order to get convictions in the terrorism cases in the 1990s, we needed to prove to the jury rationally why these people committed the atrocities they were accused of. So we had to expose them to what the ideology was and show them that the Blind Sheikh was one of the chief exponents of it, and that everything that was done in terms of their conversations and their activities was all laced with the tenets of this ideology. We're now taking that information that we use to convince juries to convict people of terrorism and telling the people that